We're beginning the Lagandula incident of Wales, December 1965, of Magic Eyes Only, Earth's Encounters with Extraterrestrial Technology by Ryan S. Wood. Stamped priority, this brief but potentially important report was quietly declassified by the British Ministry of Defence in 1996, having originated with its Defence Intelligence Staff. 17th December 1965, sighting of unusual phenomena between Ruthin and Mold on A494 map reference 172584. Mr. Kenneth William Reese saw a white light descend into valley where it exploded and disintegrated on the ground at position referenced 1965-26 Lagandula. An attempt to secure further data from the MOD, Ministry of Defense, brought forth the following response from the Government Secret Services Department. No, not secret. Why did I add that? From the Government Services Department, the registered files of the Defense Intelligence Staff, which have been selected for permanent preservation, have been assigned to a Public Record Office class, reference DEFE31. All of them are retained by the Ministry of Defense. These records are retained because they contain information relating to the security and intelligence services and are obviously highly sensitive. Next incident, Shag Harbor, Canada, October 1967. When 18-year-old fisherman Laurie Wickens dialed the number of the Barrington Passage Detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on the night of 4th October 1967, he probably had no idea of the chain of events that would unfold as a result, but he really had no choice after what he had just witnessed. Several minutes earlier, Wickens, along with 4 women in his vehicle, had been traveling west on Old Highway No. 3 in Nova Scotia. Wickens was returning his passengers to their homes after meeting them at a function nearby. As he entered the fishing village of Shag Harbor from the east, he caught sight of some lights in the sky through the car's windshield. He watched them for a few seconds while negotiating turns in the road. More and more, the lights seemed to demand his attention. They were peculiar to him. Something about them was not right. Excuse me. Not the least of which was their odd position in the starry sky. There were 4, sometimes 5 lights flashing sequentially, first from one end, then from the other, and sometimes they were all at once. They were angled downward at a 45-degree angle and seemed to be losing altitude, though not rapidly. The object that these lights were attached to could not be seen, but the positioning of the lights gave an overall impression of something quite large. What really bothered Wickens was their angle, the fact that the object was coming down into the harbor and that a crash seemed imminent. Wickens' vehicle crested the hill beside the Presbyterian Church, coasted down the hill and into the village proper, his speed now increasing so as to keep the lights in sight. He now revised his original statement of the impact site. It was beginning to appear that the object was coming down just to the west of Shag Harbor, the best mile further on. Rushing along at a good speed now, Wickens did his best to keep the object in sight, thankful for the fact in a tiny village like this on a Wednesday night at nearly 11:30 in the evening there was no traffic to contend with. Wickens wheeled his vehicle around and turned just past the entrance road to the Prospect Point Pier on his left. Just as the lights reached the top of the tree line in their downward trajectory, he knew that once he had cleared this line of trees, He would have nothing between him and the open water except 100 feet of embankment and shoreline. The lights went out of sight behind the tree line, lost from Wickens and his passengers' view for the few precious seconds. Their car rounded the turn, crested a small hill, and came into the open area. One of the girls in the back, though it has to be a typo. One of the girls in the back thought she heard a whooshing sound and a bang. Just ahead, a couple of 100 feet, was the Irish moss plant with its large gravel parking lot deserted at this late hour. Laura Wickens slowed down and pulled his car into the lot. Jamming on the brakes, everyone jumped out of the car and ran to the embankment overlooking the broad ocean expanse of the Sound a few meters in front of them. They scanned the waters for whatever had come down there, not knowing what to expect. Then they saw it, 600 or 700 feet from the shore. It wasn't very impressive at first, because they didn't know yet what they were looking at. Wickens and the others were under the impression that it was an airplane of some type, but they weren't sure. What they saw was a pale yellow light on top of a vague dark object of some description, perhaps 60 feet wide and 8 to 10 feet high. They all discussed what they should do. Wickens figured that there wasn't much they could do on their own, so he decided to drive a little further down the coast to a payphone at an Irving station in Woods Harbor. Everyone got back in the car, and Wickens wasted no time covering the mile or so to the payphone. Corporal Victor Werbicki was the only one in Barrington Passage RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, detachment at this hour, and he picked up the phone when it rang. Laurie Wickens was on the other side of the line and sounded to Wickerby as if he was very excited. Wickens told the Mountie that he thought an aircraft or big plane had just crashed into the Sound next to Shag Harbor. Corporal Weckerbecky's first question to Wickens was, "Have you been drinking?" Wickens was caught off guard by the question, but recovered and huffily replied that he had not. He informed Weckerbecky that they had seen a plane out on the water, and it still had one light on. Weckerbecky's other phone began ringing, and he asked Wickens to remain where he was after getting the payphone number, then hung up on him. Wickens was miffed, but stayed on the phone anyway, while his passengers plied him with questions. Weckerbecky answered the other line. The caller was one Mary Banks, who lived over on Maggie Garrett's Point, which initially just happened to look directly down the Sound. She was calling to voice concern that a big airplane might have just crashed into the Sound. She said she had seen some lights coming down and had heard a big bang. Weckerbecky could get no other details from her and hung up, but her phone rang again. This time it was an unidentified male caller from Bear Point, several miles to the east of Shag Harbor, who informed Weckerbecky that he had seen lights descending somewhere near Shag Harbor and thought it might have been an airplane crashing. After thanking the man, Weckerbecky went over to the radio and called the only cruiser he had out on patrol. Constable Ron Pond and Constable Ron O'Brien were in the process of returning to the detachment from their position in an area just west of Woods Harbor, where they had been looking for deerjackers when Weckerbecky contacted them by radio. He informed them that there was a possibility that a plane had crashed into the Sound near Shag Harbor and wanted them back at the detachment ASAP. O'Brien, who was working the radio, informed his superior that they had just gone through Shag Harbor, headed east, and had seen nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, they had probably passed Laurie Wickens, who was waiting patiently by the phone in Woods Harbor. Weckerbecky still was not convinced that an airplane had gone into the water. He was thinking it might have been a meteor, so O'Brien's statement probably served to reinforce his suspicions, but it had to be checked out. He called Laurie Wickens at the payphone and asked him more questions. Wickens told him about the lights they had seen coming down out of the sky, flashing on and off. Weckerbecky then asked the young fisherman if he would mind running to the Irish moss plant and keep an eye on the light out on the Sound until his officers arrived, to which Wickens readily agreed. Corporal Weckerbecky had no sooner hung up the phone when another call came in from a woman who lived in Cape Sable Island. It was about 13 miles east of Shag Harbor. She informed the Mountie that she and her daughter had just arrived home a few minutes earlier. They had seen lights coming down out of the sky, flashing in sequence that looked like they were on something that might have crashed over near Shag Harbor. That was the second time Weckerbecky had heard about those flashing lights in a line, and for the first time he entertained the idea of an aircraft incident near the harbor. He grabbed his winter coat from the coat rack and a list of fishermen's names attached to the Coast Guard Marine Rescue Auxiliary and headed out of the office. He was standing beside his cruiser, putting on his coat, when Officer Pond and O'Brien turned into the parking lot, having made good time from the Bear Point area. Some minutes earlier, while returning from dropping off their girlfriends in Cape Sable Island, Dave Kendrick and Norm Smith had had an experience similar to that of Laurie Wickens. They too were on Highway Number 3 heading west toward Shag Harbor, but they were several miles further to the east between the two entrances of the Bear Point Road Loop. This area, incidentally, would have major import in the life of Norm Smith's uncle some 3 years later. The two young men, both 18 years of age, which were in Dave Kendrick's Chevy 2, talking about girls when Norm noticed some lights up in the night sky. There were 4 or 5 of them, big lights about 15 feet apart in a straight line, red-orange in color, flashing on and off and pointing downward at a 45-degree angle. Norm pointed them out to Dave. Dave looked up through the windshield to the right. The angle being bad for him, he saw the lights, seeming to hang in the sky in a straight line. Observing them for a few seconds before the winding and hilly old road commanded his attention once more, Norm had rolled down his window in order to get a better look at the object or objects in the sky. He watched for a few moments until the combination of descending a hill and the object's downward motion caused it to go out of sight behind the trees of them. Shortly afterwards, they arrived at the outskirts of Shag Harbor where Norm lived with his father. Dave dropped him off, then drove home. On arriving, he was told his mother On arriving, he told his mother about the weird lights they had seen in the sky, then went to bed. In the meantime, after watching Dave's car drive off, Norm began to walk up the driveway to his house. His attention was drawn upward by some motion, and he was surprised to see once again the same string of lights he had seen in the sky earlier. Now above the trees again. He watched for only a few seconds before running into the house. Seeing that his father, Wilfred, was still up, Norm dragged him outside. Father and son were in time to see the object with the large red-orange lights descending at a fast pace once more behind the trees and in a direction that surely would impact somewhere in the waters of Shag Harbor. They agreed that something serious was about to happen and decided to head over in that direction to see if they could be of any help. Wilfred hurried inside and threw on some warm clothes. Then he and Norm got into the father's truck and backed down the driveway. He had to jam on his brakes to avoid backing into an RCMP cruiser that flew by with its red light flashing. Something was going on for sure. Wilfred chased down the road after the cruiser, through the village and out the past Prospect Point Road. They came around a curve in a highway and saw the cruiser pulling into the gravel parking lot beside the Irish moss plant. Wilfred pulled in beside it, and another cruiser that he had not even suspected was behind him, pulled beside his truck. I butchered that sentence, didn't I? Wilfred pulled inside, and another cruiser that he had not even suspected was behind him, pulled in beside his truck. In front of them, standing on the edge of the bank overlooking the Sound, Norm saw Laurie Wickens and some of the girls with him. Corporal Weckerbecky was with them as well, and Laurie was pointed out toward the water. Norm went out on the bank and looked too. It was then that he saw the pale yellow light out on the Sound. Corporal Weckerbecky, having now literally seen the light, put Constable Ron Pond in charge of taking statements from Laurie Wickens and the other witnesses. Weckerbecky asked around among some of the other gathered there. The area by now was becoming a popular spot, looking for a rowboat to attempt a rescue of what he considered were possible survivors of a plane crash. In fact, everyone there was of the opinion that the airplane was in distress out on the Sound. The object by now had drifted much further out than when first observed by Wickens and his friends. Radio communication was not as sophisticated in the mid-1960s as it is today. Weckerbecky could not radio directly to other locals in the province, so he told Constable O'Brien to go to the nearest phone and contact the RCC Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax to inquire about missing aircraft and bring them up to date. O'Brien was then to go to the government wharf in the center of the village and wait for Weckerbecky there. I'm saying Weckerbecky. It's Werbicky. Werbicky himself intended to find another phone and call some of the local fishermen. Constable Pond would stay at the Irish Moss plant, keeping an eye on the light's progress while continuing to take statements. Just as the two Mounties left, the situation became critical. The light suddenly disappeared. Either it went out or the structure supporting it sank. Just about two. Okay. 15 minutes later, Werbicky and O'Brien met at the government wharf as planned. Werbicky had succeeded in contacting two of the local fishermen who owned boats. One of the captains was Lawrence Smith, owner of the Ronda D. Ronda D. The other was Bradford Shand, owner of the Joan Priscilla. Both had agreed immediately to go out. As luck would have it, both boats were tied up out to the outside of all the boats moored at the wharf. Others were present at the dock, including Wilfred Smith and Norm Smith. Wilfred went aboard the Ronda D, his brother's boat. In one of those little twists of timing in a person's life, Lauren was not privy to the sight of the UFO in the sky when Norman and his father witnessed it, though Lawrence lived in the same house, but at the opposite end, it being a duplex of sorts. Wilfred had thought that his brother was probably asleep at that hour and did not want to wake him and his wife. Norm Smith went over to Bradford Shand's vessel, the Joan Priscilla, and climbed aboard with Corporal Werbicky. Norm, the fisherman himself, worked with Bradford. His friend called him Brath, as a crew member quite often, and so was familiar with the vessel. Werbicky told Constable O'Brien to go out with Lawrence Smith on the Ronda D, so that they would have an official presence on both boats. O'Brien reported to Werbicky that RCC did not have any aircraft listed as missing. However, they were going to commence a radio and phone search all up and down the eastern coast to ascertain just who might have been flying in the area, including the American military and civilian aircraft. They were also contacting a Coast Guard vessel, Lifeboat 101, in Clark's Harbor on Cape Sable Island and advising them to proceed to the crash site. The Sound is a body of water about 2 kilometers wide by 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers long. It is bounded on the east by Maggie Garron's Point, Inner Island, and Stoddard Island, and on the west was by the 3 kilometer long Outer Island. The water goes little deeper than 12 or 13 meters and is mostly a clean sandy bottom with the odd outcropping of rock and kelp beds. On the northeastern side of Outer Island, about 1,000 meters from a sand pit, is a permanently anchored buoy called the Budget Light. It had been, by estimating the height of the dark object compared to the known height of the Budget Light, 8 feet, above the water, that the fishermen at the Irish Moss plant were able to estimate the thickness or height of the pale yellow light above the water, at which outsaid fishermen Laurie Wickens and Norm Smith had assured the Mounties that the pale yellow light they were seeing off on the water was not a buoy light, because they were more than familiar with every buoy and buoy light in the Sound, and this was not one of them. Lawrence Smith's boat was in the lead, having been told the approximate position of the light before it sank, and also aware of the types of current running there and the amount of time that had passed. Lawrence opted to run a line down on the Budget Light and let the current ebb tide carry him to the south. Over on the shore, at the Irish Moss plant, Ron Pond saw the 2 fishing vessels come out of the western entrance and slowly cross the Sound. When they had traveled about halfway across the sound, Lawrence had one of the crewmen switch on the seal beam light on the top of the wheelhouse and shine it out over the water. Lawrence slowed his vessel, and the men started calling out to any possible survivors. Only a few seconds later, they came upon a patch of foam, which at first they thought was sea foam. The light picked it out, a yellow glittery substance floating 3 or 4 inches thick on the water's surface. Lawrence pulled the Ronda-D's engine back to idle and drifted into the stuff. The light on the wheelhouse played back and forth over it. The patch was huge and all around them. Joan Priscilla, her engines at idle, drifted up to them at short distance to port. Lawrence called over to Bradford Shand. What do you make of this, Brath? Don't know what it is. Can't say as I care for it, Bradford replied. Lawrence didn't care for it either. However, they had no choice but to sail through the stuff. Lawrence remembers it as smelling of sulfur, and there were bubbles coming through it. In no way did this stuff resemble ordinary sea foam. The fishermen stated years later. Both Lawrence and Norman Smith said they had never seen anything like it before or since, did not like to sail through it at the time, and avoided the general area for years after when sailing through the sound. Reaching the other side of the foamy patch, they estimated that it was about 2 boat lengths, approximately 25 meters or 80 feet wide. Later, they were able to determine that the smelly patch of foam was over half a mile, 800 meters long. Reluctantly, they steamed back and forth through the foam and the surrounding waters, looking for wreckage and survivors. RCAF squadron leader William Blaine, handling the air disc in Ottawa later that day, had already received a brief report from the RCC in Halifax stating that no aircraft or vessel were missing, as well as a message conveyed from the RCMP office in charge in Shag Harbor stating that they had found nothing after nearly 5 hours of searching. Bain read the RCMP message and scribbled 3 capital letters on the top right-hand portion of the page, then underlined it 3 times, UFO. The fishermen and crews of 6 fishing boats that had been the first to go out into the sound that night had been told to go back in by 4 a.m. the next morning. They were tired and had been up for at least 24 hours, but the search continued with other boats and fresh crews. In Halifax, the RCC had put the Navy's Fleet Driving Unit on notice that they were going to Shelburne to look for a downed UFO in Shag Harbor, and would be augmented by RCMP divers from the Halifax subdivision. 4 divers from the Fleet Diving Unit stationed on the HMS Granby and a decommissioned destroyer permanently anchored in Halifax Harbor set out for Shag Harbor in a deuce and a half truck and arrived there Friday morning, 5th of October. By 1 p.m. on Friday afternoon, the divers were ready to get into the water. They and the RCMP counterparts were working off the CG-101 and a couple of other fishing boats. They searched the bottom of the sound until nearly dusk with no results. then went at it again the next morning. Donald Nickerson, a local fisherman, recalls that the divers were close-mouthed, and I am just adding words and not saying words. My God. Donald Nickerson, a local fisherman, recalls that the divers were close-mouthed. I don't know why it's so hard for me to say that. About what they were or were not finding. Nickerson also wondered why there were submarines off the coast, one of them a U.S. Navy sub. On that Saturday's edition of the Chronicle Herald, the front page headline read, "Could be something concrete in Shag Harbor. UFO RCAF continues search today." The story under the byline, the staff writer Ray McLeod began, a spokesman for a special and little-known Royal Canadian Air Force Department for the investigation of unidentified flying objects, said last night a series of bright lights which glided into the ocean off Shag Harbor, Shelburne County, Wednesday night, may be one of the extremely rare cases where something concrete may be found. The spokesman, who identified himself as Squadron Leader Bain, said his department was very interested in the matter. One of the Granby drivers, Nick Wood, remarked to researcher Don Ledger, "We didn't find any flying saucer down there, just kelp and lobsters." He further informed Ledger that they were ready to call it quits on Saturday afternoon, but the Mounties got a message from the RCC telling them to continue the search for a few more days, which kept the divers at it until 6:30 p.m. on Monday, 8th October. Maritime Command called off the search, reporting that with reference to the Shag Harbor crash, they had found no trace, no clue, not a bit of anything. And so it seemed to end there, within a few days of hype in the press and some fears by the fishermen of the object possibly resurfacing under or near them while they were fishing in or passing through the area. 3 possibilities were offered then as to why the object had not been found. 1. The object was swept by the tides further out to sea where it came to rest. The area that far out was never searched. 2. The object, crippled, made it out into deeper waters under its own power, then sank. Again, the area was not searched beyond the sound. The object submerged, still under intelligent control, and continued to another destination along the coast. The first 2 possibilities raised some questions. First, everyone was aware that the strong currents and ebb tides in that area made it entirely possible that some object could have been swept out to sea in deeper water. Why then was the area offshore not searched as well with sonar and other methods available to the Navy, or was it? Recall Donald Nickerson's observation of some submarines off the coast. Were they looking? That is not known, and no records are available to substantiate Nickerson's statement. If they were not looking offshore, then there must be a reason why, and the only reason could be, why bother to look if you knew in the first place that the object was not there? That then makes reason number 3 look more attractive if you are a UFO investigator. And number 3 was the object submerged, still under intelligent control, and continued to another destination along the coast. Sounds about right. About a year and a half before researcher and author Don Ledger got involved in the Shag Harbor investigation, investigator Chris Stiles began an exhaustive search of all the records he could find, both in Nova Scotia and in Ottawa. When Ledger came on the scene, he and Stiles eventually joined forces though at first Ledger's part of the project was to start chronicling the material and putting it together in a book. In order to do that, Ledger conducted numerous interviews with Stiles and also re-interviewed many of the witnesses that the Stiles had. As Ledger got more involved with the incident, he uncovered witnesses of his own and learned details and anecdotal evidence that Stiles so far had not uncovered. While being interviewed by Ledger, Chris Stiles said that he had contacted or had been contacted by some people who had been in the military, each of whom had a story to tell and each of whom, save one, did not want their name mentioned in connection with the case. The fact that none of these storytellers were connected or known to one another made their stories collectively very credible. It fell to Ledger to get the stories separately, which he did with 3 out of 5 of the witnesses. The fourth had not been located, while the fifth has clammed up completely, though he had earlier submitted to an interview with Stiles and his friend Bob MacDonald. Both Stiles and MacDonald gave Ledger the same account of the interview with this man, who was one of the divers. In another occasion, Chris Stiles had run into an old friend who had retired some years before from the Air Force. Their chance conversation hinted at a tantalizing new angle on the Shag Harbor case, one that requires further verification in Don Ledger's words. They hadn't seen one another in about 3 years. They had worked together in the circulating department of a local newspaper. The friend was with his son, and all three were at the West End Mall in Halifax. When asked by the friend what Chris was up to these days, Chris took him over to his car and showed him some of the material he had in his briefcase on Shag Harbor and explained that he had been investigating the case for over a year. Chris's friend floored him by saying, "Oh yeah, the Shag Harbor crash, but you know the real story was over off Shelburne." Taken aback, Chris asked him what he was talking about. His friend explained that he had spent a week sitting on a ship off Government Point. He explained that his job in the RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, was to identify aircraft that crashed in a remote area or in deep waters from only fragments of the craft, such as a rudder or aileron hinges, for example. He explained that he had been kept below for a whole week to do his job, but nothing ever came of it. Oh, crap. He related, however, that he overheard some of the divers talking during supper one night about what they had seen below. They were promptly dressed down by some American naval officer for not keeping their mouths shut. American? Chris wanted to know what the hell American naval officers were doing giving orders to Royal Canadian naval divers on a Canadian naval vessel. His friend could not help him there. After 7 days, some of the vessels left the area at full revs, and shortly afterward, He was returned to shore with no explanation. At that point, Chris's friend said that he had to leave, and Chris left with his mouth hanging open. Stranger still, according to several witnesses, something may have flown out of the sound a week after the alleged crash. Don Ledger explains, 7 days after the Shag Harbor incident, almost to the hour, Lachlan Cameron was having TV problems. There was a white line across the screen, and it was going all squiggly. He went outside to have a look at this antenna. It was about 10 p.m. on October 11th. From his location at the back of his house in Woods Harbor, which overlooked the sound, he was startled to see a string of bright red lights climbing upward away from the water about a half a mile from his location. They then stopped and hung in the sky for some time, about 7 or 8 minutes. Lachlan was not alone in his observation. He was accompanied by his wife Lorraine, his daughter Luella, his brother Havelock Cameron, Havelock's wife Brenda, and their 2 children. They all agreed that the lights from one end to the other measured about 55 to 60 feet, and that the object stayed stationary at an altitude between 500 and 600 feet, about 3/4 of a mile offshore, before it disappeared. But that was not the end of it. 4 of the red lights reappeared a short time later in the sky, this time at a 35 degree angle. They seemed to descend northward. They seemed to descend northwest toward the horizon in the direction of Big Tusket Island. The colors of the lights slowly changed from red to yellow to orange, and then went out of sight. After that, Ledger says, things seemed to go back to normal in Shag Harbor. Next incident. Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, winter 1969. The only known reference to this crash retrieval incident comes from Sergeant First Class Clifford Stone, U.S. Army, retired, during the May 9th of 2001 press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., presented by the Disclosure Project. Stone revealed that he had been a member of a secret military unit that dealt with recoveries of downed extraterrestrial craft. I was involved in situations where we actually did recoveries of crashed saucers. For lack of better terms, Stone said, there were bodies that were involved with some of these crashes. Also, some were alive. While we were doing all of this, we were telling the American public there was nothing to it. We were telling the world there was nothing to it. Stone said that his unit was called out to a crash site in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania in 1969. He was stationed at Fort Lee, Virginia at that time as part of the 96th Civil Affairs Group, an Army Special Operations Force. He did not recall the exact date, but it was cold. I believe it to have been in the winter, but there was no snow. Stone said that the craft in question was wedge-shaped, and there were bodies when we got there. There was already a team set up. Floodlights were always set up around the object. I was asked to get closer and closer to the object to take readings with the APD-27 Geiger counter. As I did this, I realized what I was seeing was not of an earthly origin. Stone said that because of his proximity to the craft, he was the first person to see that there were bodies involved. The situation is, we did the recovery, he said. He did not elaborate further. At present, there is no other information available on this case. Next incident, St. Geniez. St. Geniez. St. Geniez, France, March 1972. According to research begun in 1986, investigator Oliver Reifel on 18th of March 1972, an unidentified aerial object crashed into the rocky slopes of a mountain in the township of St. Geniez, France. One witness described the object as a red ball of fire. Another said it was red-orange, shaped like a disc. The incident caused brush fires over the 40-acre area. Noticeably, according to researcher Gene Sider, the facts of the case remain classified in the files of the military and the National Gendarmerie Archives. Confirming all the main details was a member of an intelligence agency who stated that something was received by the Gendarmerie and shipped in a truck to a location near Paris. Next incident in Hawaii, USA, June 1973. The scant details of this case were related to Leonard Stringfield by source RK, an instructor in gunnery school at Great Lakes Naval Base in 1973 through 1974. RK said that while serving with the military, he heard that a UFO was shot down by a missile in June 1973 somewhere between mainland USA and Hawaii. According to an apparent knowledgeable source that RK spoke with, the UFO had been picked up on the radar screens of a Navy destroyer in the area and was subsequently, thanks to a lucky hit, blasted out of the sky and retrieved from a 350-foot deep water by a Glomar Explorer ship, then transferred to the U.S., specifically to a location in Chicago. Bruin Mountains, North Wales, January. Referred to by some as the British Roswell, the incident that occurred high on the Berwyn mountain range, North Wales, on the night of 20 January 1974, has become ingrained in the psyche of the British UFO research community and has largely polarized investigators into two distinct camps: those who believe that something truly anomalous occurred, i.e. that an alien spacecraft crashed on the mountainside and that extraterrestrial bodies were retrieved, and those who believe that the case has a wholly down-to-earth explanation. There is no doubt that something occurred, however, as the following testimony reveals. "I saw something bright hanging in the sky," said Annie Williams of the nearby town in Landrillo. "It had a long, fiery tail which seemed to be motionless for several minutes, going dim and then very brilliant, like a doormat fire, which keeps coming to life. It could have been like an electric light bulb in shape, except that it seemed to have rough edges. Then it fell somewhere behind my bungalow, and the earth shook." Similar testimony from David Hughes of the village post office at Ysbyty, IFAN. Ysbyfan? I'm going to call him Ysbyfan, because that's definitely not how you say it, but whatever. I can't say it at all. "The whole house shook violently, and suddenly, it began quite suddenly, lasted for a few seconds and then just stopped as suddenly. Police Constable Gwillem Owens stated, "There was a great roar and a bang. The sky lit up over the mountains. The color was yellowish, but the other people in the valley described seeing blue lights." On January 25, 1974, it was reported in the media that a Royal Air Force mountain rescue team had been dispatched to the area but found nothing. After an initial flurry of media interest and witness testimony, the incident was largely forgotten until that is around 1996, when an alleged former British Army source surfaced with a remarkable account. Retired police sergeant and UFO researcher Tony Dodd said he spoke with the British Army source, to whom he gave the pseudonym James Prescott. Prescott informed Dodd that in January 1974 he was stationed at an army barracks in the south of England. "I cannot name my unit or barracks as they are still operational," said Prescott, adding that on the night of 18 January his unit was put on standby to move north at short notice. 24 hours later, the unit was directed to make its way towards the English city of Birmingham and then received orders to proceed with speed towards North Wales. On arrival at Llangollen, North Wales, on the night of 20 January, Prescott said the unit noticed a great deal of ground and air activity in the area. Extraordinary events were unfolding, but it was shortly after 11:30 p.m., by Tony Dodd's account, when things really began to take shape. Prescott told him, "We, that is myself and 4 others, were ordered to go to Landerfell and were under strict orders not to stop any civilians. The team soon reached Landerfell, whereupon they were ordered to load 2 large oblong boxes into their vehicle. We were at this time warned not to open the boxes, but to proceed to the Chemical and Biological Defence Establishment at Porton Down, Wiltshire, England, and deliver the boxes. A number of hours later they reached Porton Down, and the mysterious cargo was quickly taken inside the facility. The staff at Porton allegedly opened the boxes while Prescott and the others looked on. Inside the boxes, to Prescott's amazement, were 2 creatures which had been placed inside decontamination suits. The Porton staff then began the careful task of opening the suits. Said Prescott, "When the suits were fully opened, it was obvious the creatures were not of this world, and when examined were found to be dead. When I saw in the boxes that they made me change my whole concept. What I saw in the boxes that day made me change my whole concept of life. The bodies were about 5 to 6 feet tall, humanoid in shape, but so thin they looked almost skeletal with a covering skin. Although I did not see a craft at the scene of the recovery, I was informed that a large craft had crashed and was recovered by other military units." According to Prescott, his team were not the only ones to transport bodies from the crash site. Sometime later, we joined up with the other element of our unit, who informed us that they had also transported bodies of alien beings to Porton Down, but said that their cargo was still alive. Prescott added that this was the only time I was ever involved in anything of this nature. This event took place many years ago, and I am now retired from the armed forces. Live aliens loose on the Barweens? This extraordinary claim was dismissed outright by some researchers. For example, one of the leading investigators of the case, Andy Roberts, has stated the following in the book Out of the Shadows that he co-authored with Dr. David Clark. The MOD allowed us access to the UFO reports they received for January 1974. These consist of accounts of lights seen streaking through the night sky from east to west, at times exactly matching the UFOs seen over the Berwyn Mountains. University astronomy records reveal these lights were bolides, bright meteors which fly close to Earth to the Earth's atmosphere and often explode in vivid bursts of color. The bodies were seen from 7:30 p.m. to 8 p.m., during which time a localized earth tremor was felt in North Wales. But for many who experienced the bodies and the bolides and the tremors, not knowing their source, it appeared that something, perhaps a plane, had crashed. Like so many UFO mysteries, the Berwyn Mountain case stems from radical misinterpretation of natural phenomena, complicated by the need to believe in the mysterious. Roberts's theory is certainly a valid one, and there appears little doubt that he has resolved many of the key surrounding factors of the case. However, since the account of James Prescott surfaced in 1996, a number of former employees of the nearby RAF, Royal Air Force Valley Base, have come forward, some speaking on the record to assert that they had heard similar tales of alien bodies being removed from the mountain and taken to Portendown as far back as 1975 and 1979. It seems likely, therefore, that the controversies surrounding the true nature of the events that occurred on the Berwyn Mountain Range, North Wales, on the night of 20 January 1974 is set to continue. And there's a picture section here that I'll get to tomorrow. Yeah, we'll do that tomorrow. And then a semi-long incident in Chihuahua, Mexico. Until next time.